Yeah. So this is something starting, making a film.
Let me start with a happy new year and wish you all the best in 2022. Thank you for following us and being with Scott in last year. And we hope that we have you with us in many webinars that we will have in 2022. Before I start to introduce our webinar and today's moderator, which is Professor Metin Kozak from Turkey, I would like to ask our curator of SCOT, Professor Jafar Jafari, to enlighten us with the opening remark. Professor Jafari, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Kazem, and Happy New Year. At my end, good morning. It's 5:30 in the morning here. Thank you for joining our 35th webinar. And then we have some satellite webinars. So actually, we have done over 40 webinars already. The point I would like to make, and some of you have heard me many times, if you're a repeat person in the audience, there is something special or unique about our webinar series. We are dealing with big issues and small issues, but these are the issues or problems that are faced by the informal sectors of the tourism industry, small operators, small communities, forgotten hosts, the sort of people who do not have the size to demand attention. Governments even forget them or ignore them or doesn't take care of them. In reality, if you add up all the small operators of the tourism industry, they sum up to be more than 50% of the tourism industry. But all the attention by the government, by the public, by everybody is given to large operators, large destinations, for big traffics, airlines, chain hotels, the like. So that always the local, small communities, small operators are forgotten. They don't know what question to ask. They don't know whom to ask the question. They do not know what answers they might get. And it's all sort of problems. So we decided that the time has come to deal with this subject, which is not even receiving enough attention in the literature, academic literature. Most of the attention that we get is about millions of Chinese coming. This is before coronavirus, and French tourists are coming, and German tourists are coming, and this is how to accommodate them. So it's always the big issues and the big volumes. So we are talking about small volumes going to small places, doing small things. So that's the purpose of the conference, of the webinar series. All of the past ones are available on YouTube. And in my opinion, those of you who are professors of hospitality and tourism, you may find some of them as good reading assignment for the students to watch in the class and to discuss it, to critique it, and so on and so forth. So welcome to our webinar series, and I pass on the podium to you, Qasim, or to Metin.
Thank you, Jafar. Thank you for your informative opening remark, as always. Our professor, Metin Kozak, is too famous that I can introduce him. We know him with Anatolia, the journal that he is co-editing it, and more than 30 books and so many journal articles. He has been working with over 40 countries in research and several universities, including the Namur in Belgium and Polytechnic in Hong Kong. Today's webinar is the second of the series that Metin has been organizing with the SCOT, and I would like to ask Metin to start the webinar as the boss of today's discussion. Metin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kazem. Thank you, Hira, for your support to make this webinar series, such a successful event. Yes, as you said, this is our second series on the same subject. The first one was in April. I think it was the 18th or 17th of April last year. But it was in Turkish. So then we had some requests from our colleagues from different countries to repeat the same session, same webinar in English. So that's why together with Jaffa, we started, organizing this second webinar in English to make it more international. And we approach scholars who are very international and who are very strong in the academic background. The first one, Kazem just introduced Jafar Jafari. He is the father of our modern tourism. I think everybody knows him. And if there will be anyone who doesn't know Jafar, I think he or she is missing a lot in our field. So Jafar got his PhD in cultural anthropology from the University of Minnesota. I think he is now retired from the University of Wisconsin, and he might be, I think, not in Mallorca. It seems to be in US, I think, because he had to wake up very early this morning, Saturday morning. And our second speaker is Tamara Ratz from Budapest, Hungary. She has her PhD in, I think, business and economics, I think from the Budapest University of Economics and Public Administration. She is also very well known, I think, a keynote speaker in cultural heritage tourism. And she's working now with, what is the name of your university, Tamara? Kodolonyi Janos?
Kodolonyi Janos, yes.
I have been there, but I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry. Kodolonyi Janos University in Hungary. Our third speaker is again from Europe, from Turkey, Aslan Aykaç. She is also professor in sociology at Ege University in Izmir. She has her PhD in sociology from the University of Binghamton in the United States. She's not very, I think, active in research, but she writes many good, books and also some articles making critiques about, different aspects of our daily life and our, business life. She has also some good publications on the transformation of workforce or labor force in tourism too. And our final speaker is from Australia. So I think this is a good, coincidence for us, or good reason to say to somebody, in the United States, good morning, and for us to have a, good afternoon, and for some other speakers like, Asia, Aisha in Australia, she might be too late for her, I think after midnight in Australia to, the time to sleep. Aisha is also a good friend of us. She had her PhD in tourism from the University of Surrey in United Kingdom. I think you are working at University of South Australia, right, Aisha?
Yeah.
Okay, she's an expert in food tourism, marketing, and sustainability of tourism. I don't want to keep too much because when I check our former webinar, I saw that it took about more than 2 hours. So I just want to keep my introduction and then start, asking the questions. And then we want to make this webinar as much interactive as possible, because as we know, the topic is also very dynamic and it's also very up to date. That we can also in the end get some more questions or comments from our audience. So my first question is, so the title of this webinar is Glocalization of the Tourism Industry. So just to introduce the subject, what do we understand by the meaning of glocalization? And okay, perhaps we can define it in different ways, but we also need some examples in our our daily life or in tourism context. So just to make the definition of glocalizations better and more understandable, mainly by our young scholars in tourism or in other fields. Shall I start from Jaffa?
Sure. Thank you very much, Metin. And it's difficult to start and also difficult to conclude. Globalization or glocalization has been in our vocabulary for many years. Of course, globalization was the first one. Glocalization came later on. In anthropology, we have something we call acculturation, when two different cultures come together and learn from each other. Globalization, the way we understand it, or the way I understand it, is basically a sort of Western-oriented concept. In other words, if changes are really taking place in the sense of globalization, the developing countries get ideas from developed countries. So it's a traffic of globalization from west to the east, from north to the south type of things. The issue when it comes to tourism, again, we have acculturation and anthropologists deal with that. But when we turn acculturation to tourism, then glocalization would be the right terminology. And basically, the issue is now whether countries, destinations need to hold on to their own color, to their own character, to their own naturalness, or should they adapt or change? And if they adapt, in what direction? Again, as I suggested, usually glocalization is a Western idea or Northern idea, going to the south and east. You find many articles that favor the concept that destinations should remain true to their own identity. They should hold on to their own colors, and so on and so forth. And yet at the same time, the pressure of globalization makes it difficult for them. So what I would like to suggest, Metin, as a point of guiding more or less our discussion, let us do what we do in academia, break down the problem to something a bit more manageable. Metin, when we are talking about glocalization, are we talking about physical changes, like influence on the architecture, infrastructure, superstructure, etc.? Or are we talking about cultural glocalization? Are we talking about service? Service is the key word in hospitality and tourism. Is service being the subject that we are talking about? So please keep in mind that I'm encouraging us to think physical and material and immaterial, physical and culture type of things. Service is extremely important in tourism. And I think if I understand the concept of glocalization, glocalization means services upgraded to the Western level. Is this the right way to go? Is this what we mean by glocalization of services? Or the word hospitality, which is the key concept in hospitality in the subject of tourism. Is it hospitality which is being glocalized? Or is it the service? Or is it both of them? And then the other question is, are we talking about a superstructure, physical glocalization? So I want to make this that hopefully when we are commenting, we are more clear about what sort of glocalization we are talking about. I hope this helps not confuse the matter. Back to you, Metin.
Thank you, Jafar. I think the difference between tangibility or intangibility, in a tourism or service context, I think was one of our, questions in the first webinar. And it seems that I think it might be easier, for globalization, mainly for the, tangibility, I think is for the intangible part of tourism services or tourism culture, I think cannot be, as much easy as, in the tangible context. Yes, so shall we continue with Tamara? With the same question?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a very, very complicated issue, and like Jafar said, it's reflected in both material and immaterial changes. For a long time in tourism history, most of the visitors came from Western countries, so their expectations, their requirements had an impact on the local services, local products, tourism products everywhere. But I think it's also very important to realize that when we talk about tourism and globalization, that most of the trends that affect tourism are not directly related to tourism. So that the fact that people all around the world are listening to the same music, that the same brands appear, and I'm not talking about tourism brands only, but other kinds of consumer products. The same brands appear all around the world, that the same movies are popular around the world, and many cases, people around the world are aspiring to a similar quality of life. This is not an impact of tourism development, but this is something that affects tourism development. And so far, yes, glocalization for me meant that tourists are looking for local cultural experiences. That's the reason why they travel, because they would like to see something different, but they also expect Western style amenities. So for example, in Hungary, when you go to the countryside because you want to enjoy rural tourism, you still want to have a modern bathroom in the building, and you don't want to go out to the well and bring in the wood, bring in the water, bring in the food, etc., as it has been traditionally popular or done. But I think I was thinking about examples, and I found two examples that I think are good illustrations of glocalization. One is a Hungarian example. In Hungary, embroidery. There are lots of different styles of embroidery, and every region is very proud of their own distinctive style. And there is one style that's called matyó in the northeastern part of the country. And an entrepreneur from Budapest decided, so from the capital, decided that this embroidery, this tradition is really valuable, but it was losing popularity because young people or people nowadays do not really wear hand embroidered clothes or costumes. So, but like I said, it has come from a city that she decided to create an enterprise or matyó design where local old ladies who still have the ability, the experience in making this embroidery, they started, first producing products, clothes, embroidering clothes that they could sell mostly to tourists as souvenirs. They developed a really good network with retail partners. This all came to a halt with COVID because all these shops closed. And then they started organizing tours where visitors first from Hungary, but also foreigners can go to these villages. We are only talking about one village or two villages, so it's a very small region. And they can learn how to make the embroidery, they can taste the local food, they can have a personal experience, personal encounter with these ladies. And so this is an example of creative tourism, which has become a trend in the last 10, 15 years, but applied to the local circumstances, the local situation, it provides employment for about 30 people. So it's a very small business, but it has become very, very successful, very popular. And so I think in this case, the fact that this small community of elderly ladies could actually draw upon a global practice, it's been very advantageous. And another example that I saw in Namibia in my last overseas trip before COVID, that there are many so-called living museums where the local communities, like in our case, it was the Damara community, one of the traditional Namibian communities, they show their traditional life. And this is not the life they live anymore, obviously. So they spend their day in this living museum, which is like an open air museum. They show how they used to make fire with the fire stick, etc. And then they go home in the evening. They go home to brick houses, and they are not living in tents anymore, etc. And I usually don't like such attractions because they feel like human zoos, so they are not really attractive. But in this case, this museum was developed with German aid and by help from a German foundation. And you could see the difference because it was very professional. It didn't try to be more than a tourist attraction. So they didn't try to pretend that, oh, this is the way the Damara are living, and now you are getting this authentic experience. No, it was not. It was a museum, or it was a tourist attraction, but it was very professional. And the actors who basically, they didn't pretend to be living in the past. They showed us some traditions, but we could also have a conversation about the impact of climate change on their community. And it was actually quite a strange experience having a conversation with someone in a hunter-gatherer costume about climate change. But I found that the professionalism made this whole experience more accessible for us visitors, because there was no pretense. There was no, they were not trying to create this make-believe story. And but still learned a lot about their past, about their heritage. And I think, again, in this case, the way that they used Western style interpretation techniques, it did help for visitors to really understand the experience.
Thank you, Tamara, for giving also some nice examples from different countries, mainly from established destinations in different continents. Yes.
May I jump in on Tamara's point by saying that thank you, Tamara, for taking us on to a number of different fronts, and you introduced the point that some cultures which don't exist anymore, they don't live anymore, they are refabricated or recreated or re-authenticated for the purpose of the tourist. And I want to pose a question now: is this the right thing to do, or is this the wrong thing to do? Is this more educational for the national people, local people, to remember how it was, or is it really of value to nations, developing countries, that they do not want to really present their past. They want to say, we are a new front, we are a new destination, we are a new civilization. So it creates a sort of issue here for me as an anthropologist. Are we helping the local people to get to know themselves, or are we Tamara, what do you think the message was? This reminds me also of the Korean village that talks about the Korean life in the old days, and the same thing in Williamsburg, Virginia, in the United States, which is talking about hundreds of years ago, and it shows that to us. So what are your views on that, Tamara?
Like I said, I normally have some sort of a reservation against such tourist attractions, because if usually they in Europe we and in the Western countries we have open air museums where the same thing happens, that we have interpreters dressed up in traditional costumes, and they show us how they used, you know, weaving and how they used to cook a meal on the fire, and we don't find anything negative in this. We understand that this is their role, this is their job, it's like acting. And usually in the developing countries, we feel that that the locals are forced to pretend that they are still living in the past, because this is what tourists would like to see. So when they go to Namibia, when they go to Africa, the southern part of Africa, when they go to Asia, they would like to see the tribes, the tribal life. They would like to see this exotic local culture. And I think I draw the line at when it's clear for everybody involved that this is not real anymore, that this is like an open air museum, like the Skansen in Stockholm. This is not the local life. And that's why I like this Damara example. I normally don't like such places, but here there was a line. So as we were talking to the people who were playing their role, basically they spoke English. They were having fun. There were situations when they were playing a game, like guys sitting in a pub playing cards. And yes, we were there and they showed us how to play that game, but they would have played that game without us too. So that was their way of enjoying themselves. So here I found that it's very clear for everybody that this is not tribal life, this is not reality. So I could enjoy it. If they had pretended to live like this and would have tried to sell this experience to me as the authentic Namibian experience, then I would have found that this is not fair, neither with the visitors, nor with the locals who are part of this experience.
Thank you.
Okay, Jafar, is it enough for you?
Definitely, it helps. But it becomes a question: how deep do we go into the culture? How far do we go into the past, and how artificial is what we bring forward if it is not practiced? So it is a part of what is this part of globalization or not?
The reason why I brought this example as an illustration of glocalization, that I felt that, at least for me or for us, I was there with a friend and we kind of agreed that this was a tourist attraction developed for visitors, but it also provided income for those who were working in this attraction. But the reason why I think it was good, attractive, enjoyable, because they did receive help in how to set up this museum. So they did use techniques that they would have been used in Europe, that would have been used in the United States, etc. So they were not left alone to try to show something to the tourists. And then I think it actually made it a more professional tourist attraction, and not something authentic, an example of real life, but this kind of life doesn't exist anymore, and visitors are interested in it. And this way, I think this community was able to, again, to create a barrier as well, that when tourists are looking for seeing the Damara in Namibia, they didn't go to the actual Damara village, which you may say it's less of an authentic experience, but also less intrusion into their lives.
Okay, thank you, Tamara. I think you just mentioned about authenticity, authentic culture. So my second question, the second round, will be about this, tourism and authenticity. Yes, Aslan, what do you think about this glocalization? And do you have any, let's say, good examples that you just, experienced in some way?
I'm thinking. So Tamara's example was very lively from Namibia. It just reminded me that long time ago, I went to South Africa for a conference, and there they offered a visit to a Zulu village for some of the participants. And I didn't go for the simple reason that it was just too annoying for me, knowing that, after all that history of colonialism and everything, having a genuine Zulu experience would not be possible. And I was in this big city, I was in Durban, and the people there are not living like, with straw skirts or doing the dance or something like that. So I was too conscious to enjoy something like that kind of a visit. So my example would be my rejection. I don't know, as a tourist behavior, what you would make out of this, but it was just, I don't know, I don't feel comfortable. I still, seek that genuine experience. But then again, there are, some other examples that I want to focus. But before I start, I just want to underline some concepts that I thought were important in our analysis of globalization. And one of this, tension between universal and particular, which is, universal represented by these global forces acting upon the local, and then the particular is the local, the quintessential local elements, whatever they are. But this relationship does not always come in binaries. I mean, it's not one type of globalization affecting one type of local. There are multiple waves of globalization. I think I would benefit in this case from the perspective of Arjuna Padurai in his analysis of cultural hybridization, who looks at financial flows, ideological flows, technological flows, the role of media and information technology, and finally tourism and migration and mobility of the people. All of these forces affect the globalization side of the story. So it's not just, I think culture is at the very core of this discussion, but it's fed by these financial, technological, and ideological externalities. So that's one side of the story that I wanted to say. And on the local side, there are many locals that are kind of reproducing and interacting with each other. So for that, I have, some interesting examples, 3 examples from where I live. There are these, 2-3 day fests, festivals held in Izmir, which is, roughly speaking, a city of 5 million population. So there's the coffee fest. We don't grow coffee. We don't have coffee, as an agrarian produce or as a cultural heritage or anything of that sort. Yes, we have the Turkish coffee, but that coffee is imported into Turkey all the time. So that's one thing. And you're like, why coffee? Why not tea, for example? This is a tea country. And then the second example, we have a Holi fest, which is this Indian fest with the colors, the dyes and everything. We don't have any Hindus here, I think. That's one thing. And then it becomes this big hit. People do celebrate it. I don't know if they even know what Holi is or what it stands for, really. So that's the interesting thing. The third thing is that only in my neighborhood, we have like 3-4 sushi restaurants. And this is like, it's a big hit. But on the other hand, it's very recent. and you know all this, you know, the gastronomic background of sushi, that a sushi chef, it takes like 25 years to become a sushi chef or something like that. And then you have it in the neighborhood. It's kind of an interesting locals interaction. So I think this is a very multidimensional issue that we have to take a look at. And it's not just, you know, a binary. It cannot be reduced into a binary. That's one thing I wanted to say. And in terms of the tension between this universal and particular, there are three, you know, premises that I thought were worth underlining. One of them is the inevitability of cultural change. No matter what the externalities are, even if it remains within its very locale without any kind of external influence, it is going to change. That's kind of, you know, what time does to you. The second thing is the reciprocity that we have to focus on this relationship. So as much as globalization changes and challenges the local transforms the global flows and the global transformations, as, you know, David Held calls. So how does the local play into the globalization process when, you know, sushi comes to Izmir, to Turkey? Okay, so that reciprocity is something very interesting, I think, to follow. And the third thing, which, you know, I don't exactly at this moment have an example, but resistance. So there are certain locales that resist this global transformation. In what ways and why, I think, are, you know, questions worth to think about.
Thank you, Aslıhan. I think it seems that you might also be against Turkish belly dancing. Huh?
I'm not against, but and plus that's not only Turkish. That's okay. Like, you know, Tunisian, Egyptian, and many other places at the same time. And it's nice.
So what about Turkish kebab and Turkish döner? You know, it is original from, let's say, from Turkey. But the Turkish döner is served, you know, in different forms in many countries, and mainly in Europe, you know, and perhaps in. So, how do you consider this, you know, this kind of transformation in Turkish kebab or döner, you know, in terms of glocalization?
I don't know. It's interesting. Last year, I read this article in one of the Italian cities. I think, I don't know if it was Naples or Florence or someplace like that. Turkish kebab was banned because the smell was basically where?
It was Venice.
It was Venice. So the smell was actually surrounding the whole city. So the Italians said, hey, you know, that's too much. So there are moments like that. As I said, you know, that's the inevitable cultural transformation and cultural interaction that we're going to experience, especially with, you know, given the global dynamics that feed into it. But then again, you know, how genuine it is, how, you know, let's go to the authentic side of it. You have to go to Gaziantep for that, which is like the original place for kebab.
Okay, thank you, Aslan. Yes, Ayşe, please.
Yeah, it's good to go through all different perspectives, actually, and we talk about intangible versus the tangible, the values. And I really like, Tamara, your example about the food and also the open museum, which is good to see that how the community is actively involved to engage and to change it their own the way of the displaying how they live. And yeah, Aslan, your point on the cultural transformation is quite a good point. And so I want to actually bring up to that conceptual point of view is like, I think the reason we're discussing here is because of the impact of tourism on the society, destination is quite severe. I think that's the original reason we have to start with why glocalization is important, why we need to discuss. Because previously, I think much of the literature will talk about impact of tourism is always either positive, negative, and then we often talk about how bad globalization is to impact on the destination, especially from standardization perspective or McDonaldization perspective. So we often have that bipolar perspective toward the globalization, saying that we shouldn't really accept the globalization without really thinking. We should also find a way to minimize that negative impact of that globalization on tourism destination and needed to have the new approach. So I think that's why sustainability concept bring up this combining integrated approach to the between the globalization and localization, and then new terminology come out with that integrated approach to balancing this globalization and localization, because in our life, we cannot avoid the globalization and trend. We are living with the technology. We're living with that commercialization and the global trade. So in that means that the tourism is always become part of that the trend, and people will travel, then they will learn from there, and of course the local will adapt from there. So it was quite interesting for me is to learn that when we cannot avoid this globalization, but if we needed to make the good balance between that traditional protection or authenticity and the standardization for satisfying consumers' need, then yeah, glocalization is important. So we start with that identity development, and also how we can also try to also make sure that the cultural identity or even society identity can be compatible with that local people's the current living as well. So I would like to talk about cultural compatibility or social compatibility from to address that, how we can bring up the benefit of the globalization, because I think we shouldn't always say, oh, globalization is bad, localization is important. We have to come out with from locals' perspective, how they can learn to adapt to bring up more the suitable or compatible the element which can reflect their traditional identity, but also still can manage that the demand from the consumers like that as well. So I was really surprised because everybody talking about some example, and Bettin, you talk about dance. So I would want to talk about Hawaiian dance, hula dance. You remember hula dance, right? Everybody knows the hula dance in Hawaii. Because when I learned from the academic textbook, because I never had the experience of the hula dance, and the way they media or tourism the academic textbook, they portray how bad the tourism industry is influence negatively the Hawaiians, the culture. And so I learned that, oh, it's all bad. Tourism is really negative impact on the hula dance formation. The hula dance is more try to attract during the American middle-aged businessmen. And so that's why all the Hawaiian women dressed up like a bikini style of clothes, showing more skin and try to luring men. And so their way of the hula dance is too commercialized. So it's become more globalized because of the influence of tourism. So that's what I've been learning. But when I went to Hawaii, it was the really different experience for me, because what Hawaiian people adapted to that basically the Hawaiian, the hula dance culture, with make sure they bring up the local identity as much that they can. So instead of just the demonstrating the traditional style of the hula dance, which is more like, of course, they do some of those the performance oriented the tourism experience. But when I went to the park, there are so many different types of the hula dance, the activities, which is the local people, the dancers come out and teach all the tourists who are relaxing on the park. They teach why their hula dance has different meaning of the when they deliver. So when they posing these kind of things and they're using this hand, that means they are actually picking up the fruits from the trees. They're also the fishing from the sea. So each of those, the motion of dance, they carry on the local people's lives. So what the tour, cultural tour of the hula dance, they explain to the tourists is that the hula dance, of course, originally is more about storytelling of the local people's life, because they don't have much of the written alphabet letter in the Hawaiian community. So they use the dance as a storytelling, and mostly those dance was performed by the man, not to the woman. But of course, over the time when tourism become popular, the local community adapted themselves to change too much to satisfy the tourists only. So they become way too much the commercialized and lose their hula dance identity. But then they learn that when they have done this kind of the commercialized, globalized activities, and it become they kind of the people start to see that as a negative impact of tourism. So they come up with some way, it's a creative tourism style, as Tamara mentioned, but it's more for the educational perspective, and which is it was a really different experience for me. It's like, of course, it's not the typical traditional style of the performance, but still they adapted their traditional style but it's delivering their traditional value, which is still compatible to their true identity, which is perceived by local people. And it was, and when I had the learning experience with the local people who teach how to, have a proper hula dance, it's not the traditional style, but still it was a very valuable experience for me to making those balance, the culturally compatible related to tourism experience like that. So basically, even local people had to learn they have to come out with their own the power to create their reproduction of their culture from, of course, make sure not to lose completely their own identity or traditional value, but also revitalize their traditional ideas and the values in a different way, still a commercial way, but it's, of course, it have to be more compatible for that. So I would of course, it's still a challenging issue. I'm not saying the glocalization is come out with that easy, because we can see those examples so many ways in, of course, the food tourism. I could give so many different examples here as well, but try to make it short. I think Hawaiian dance was one of the example which shows that when they are confronted dealing with that conflict, the impact of tourism, and they try to learn to challenge that issue using this cultural compatibility to make the integrated approach between their traditional values as well as the contemporary, the cultural the approach as well. So it was I think that's another way I think we need to also think about when we're discussing the globalization. Of course, all this kind of impact of the external factors or even tourism industries on the destination would be always issue. But the question is how we can make it more compatible for the long term, the sustainability. I think that's another direction we need to think about that. So yeah.
Thank you, Aysel, for your long discussion about the sustainability of the culture as well as globalization. Yes, I think we have also one question about this authentism. Tamara just mentioned about it. So can I just address this question to you, Tamara? So, well, in Turkey, I can see some, increasing number of, let's say, articles or theses, on authentism and tourism. And people think that tourism brings authentism to a certain culture or certain location, and we can also see some similar articles or theses in the international academia. So Tamara, what do you think about this tourism, the relationship between tourism and authentism? They are good friends, or they are like brothers and sisters, or good friends, or they are complementing each other, or they are the enemies. Tourism is the enemy for authentism.
Again, I think it's very complicated because like Aslihan and Isa mentioned, that cultural change is inevitable, whether there is tourism or not. And also what we consider authentic, it's also changing. Like the example, it also came to my mind, this example, when you were talking, before you mentioned actually the gyros in Italy, that they banned it in Venice because they wanted to make sure that the gastronomic supply of the city remains authentic Italian. But what do the local people think about it? Just because they are born in Venice, do they want to eat Italian food? I mean, the local Venetian people for the rest of their lives? or should they also have access to sushi, gyros, whatever? So I think one of the important issues, and I don't have the whole truth, but one of the important issues is what Isa already mentioned, that who has control over the changes, so who makes the decisions, whether the local community has the power to make decisions on how their culture, either their heritage or the present contemporary culture, is packaged for tourists, or if it's their decision, or it's decided by someone else for them, tour operators, and even within the community there might not be consensus. So some developers may fear that yes, we should create a festival for tourists. Like it was an interesting example, the coffee festival in Izmir, especially the fact that you bring it up, because for me, yes, of course, coffee, Turkish coffee, they are related. Turkish coffee is actually on UNESCO's immaterial cultural spirit, intangible cultural heritage list. So yes, of course, there should be a coffee festival in Izmir. But if you feel that not authentic, that's an interesting question for me, for an outsider. So it's I think it's a very complex issue.
I just wanted to add something. The coffee festival wasn't about Turkish coffee.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It
yeah.
was coffees coming from Guatemala, Colombia, whatever, and all that variation on macchiato and whatnot. So it wasn't actually about Turkish coffee. If it was, that would be kind of like having an authentic edge, but like this, it was kind of imported.
Yes, I understand, but that's the same question whether people living in Turkey, they already have the Turkish coffee, so they probably would like to have other kind of coffee, and this is a global trend. So this is a trend that spread around the world. The new style of coffee, new all different techniques, and we also find this new wave cafes everywhere, basically in the world. So authenticity, sometimes we try to keep experiences authentic, may also mean that we limit these experiences. And that might be good for tourism, because then, yes, you are guaranteed that you will have this authentic Turkish experience as a visitor. But is it good for the local people?
Thank you, Tamara. Jafar, do you have any contribution to this question?
Well, I have more questions than answers. Yeah, going back to who I think it was Aslan who talked about universalism versus particularism and reciprocity. Reciprocity, it means a two-way traffic. And I'm not quite sure if when we are talking about glocalization, it's a two-way traffic. Often it is the Western culture which makes the changes, not the local. The local are the losers. And the sort of things we do in tourism favors the tourist, not the local community. So what happens if we bring out a layer of culture which doesn't exist anymore, but the local people are not very proud of it? It's a past that they want to forget, but the tourists would really, really like it. So which way should the local go? Bring their past and try to shy away from it, or what should they do? So this is many of the pasts that are brought forwards are basically for economic reasons of tourism rather than for cultural reasons, in my opinion. And the issue of authentication is a really hard one to talk about, how authentic a local community could be. To use example of the 2 points put together, in some Asian countries 100 years ago, how did they eat? They ate with their hands. Okay, If you do that in the tourism industry, the local people wouldn't really like that. They say, this is not us. This is not what we want to be. This is what we wear. So is tourism supposed to help, or is it supposed to create conflict? So we have, and I say that because I have been a tour guide myself, and I had to deal with this kind of issues of the past versus present, of the history versus what the country wants to be. So it becomes a difficult balance to maintain. And I wonder what should the tourism industry should do, and particularly what should the local communities do that? The small local communities. That's exactly where the color still remains. In the big city of Istanbul, how much of Turkey do you find in Istanbul? But if you go to a village, you find a lot of Turkey in that little village. So the real colors are still in those small communities that are being bombarded by globalization. And they have, if they listen to tourism, they have to hold on to the past. But as the local people in a village, do you want a McDonald's? They would vote for it. I bet they would vote for it.
Okay, thank you, Jafar. But sometimes, internalization like McDonald's or fast food could be, very helpful for somebody like myself, in Thailand, So if you are not very good at, having the local cuisine, local food, because of its taste, different materials, so McDonald's can help you. So so internalization could be more helpful than localization, I think, in some contexts. Okay, so yeah.
But I think, if I may, yeah.
Yes, please.
This is exactly why what Jafar just said, that this is exactly why I saw that one of the most important issues is that who has control over what kind of identity is presented or how it is presented. Because yes, sometimes tourists are looking for experiences like that okay, well, we think that in this country people still eat with their hands, and I think it should be possible, and it should it should be possible to explain that no, this is not the case anymore. I know that as a tour guides often again thread a very narrow path, that they're trying to tell an interesting story, an exciting story. They try to meet the tourists' expectations, but they also try not to, color this truth too much. But I think it should be important to present, the actual local life. So if it's an actual village, and that's why I thought that this Namibian example was a good case, because then they separated these two realities. So they didn't try to pretend in their actual life that they're living like they were 200 years ago, but they also gave tourists a chance to see something of that by making it sure that this is not reality anymore. I find it more problematic when these two layers are not divided, when the locals are making a desperate effort to pretend that they are something else than they actually are, because that would be more attractive for the tourists.
Okay.
Can I add something?
Please, Aslan, yes.
I just want to touch upon 2 points. I think it's very important that, Tamara mentioned the agency behind the authenticity. I noted here, the moment that a practice, a service, or a commodity, or something tangible becomes marketed, it runs the risk of mass production, and therefore the lack of authenticity. So basically having a conscious decision making, on behalf of the locals, especially them deciding, how to perform and how to produce, is an important dimension. And that's why, for example, I also noted standardized production of goods, the way of consuming, whether with hands or not, but also standardized and certified production of goods is also, an interesting edge to follow, whether we're keeping the authentic practice or not. In Turkey, there is Iskandar, for example, the Turkish gyro, produced in a certain manner in a certain location that has a geographic sign, and it's under this, certified whatever production line. So that's one thing important, I think, that we need to really question and follow. Professor Jafari's comment on reciprocity was really important in the way that it underlines the power dynamics behind this reciprocity and the asymmetry, I have to say, between the impact and the influence. I think the reason I find that local has an impact on the global has to do with what I said, the way that we talk about multiple localities and not so much of a binary, between the global and the local. And what is also very interesting for me, for example, the impact of migration in building new locals in a foreign land. Little Italy is a popular example, right? Or there is a Chinatown is another example, for example, in several, cities in the world. So these examples, and currently in Istanbul, we have a neighborhood where there's a strong African community. So these new locales are being made. And that, I think, somehow contributes to this whole glocalization process. And it's very interesting. The Syrians, for example, in Turkey, approximately 5 million currently, has made a big hit with falafel. And it's incredible because, some 10 years ago, it wasn't such a popular thing in Turkey. And now it is. And the same thing with music as well. So I don't know. It's interesting to, follow a locale within a locale kind of story. But definitely power plays into it big time.
Thank you, Aslı. Yes, Ayse, please.
Well, for me, I think everybody.
Yes.
Oh, sorry, Mete, you said something.
Yes, please keep it a little short, Just
okay, I will skip all the examples. I just want to quickly add on because everybody already covers the key issues. But I think it's especially nowadays, the even authenticity concept become more complicated than before, because it used to be very much the simple way of discussing like how we're going to protect that tangible element, how we're going to also revitalizing the intangible elements. So they try to talk about cool authenticity or hard authenticity or constructive authenticity versus the activity-oriented authenticity. But at the moment, I think it's one of the trend here is that it's the way tourism complements the authenticity. Is the one of the way of they're showing is that is a creative tourism, because now so what happened is that some of the destinations, the governments, they put the strong policy for the investment into the young generation or even tourism industry into the creative class, the strategies. So what it means by then is that they encourage for tourists to learn from the artists, local entertainers, or local educators to learn about their local culture. But the tourists, the one who co-created of that, the local culture oriented the product, and that will create again people perceived as authenticity. And also local people see that as they supporting for the younger generation or the artists to showing that their creativity instead of just always keeping the same tradition all the time, same identity. Actually, it's supporting the creative freedom of artists. And I think that is another perspective way of the authenticity. And I think tourism play a very important role to supporting the creative freedom, the class, which can help out for the younger generation to revitalize their traditional identity, for the educating tourists to learn more about their local culture. So for example, Aboriginal people teach their Aboriginal painting instead of selling Aboriginal painting to the tourists. And actually Aboriginal people don't make much money. They just tourism industry, they take a lot of money from the original, the painting of the Aboriginal people, because they have a commission fee from there. But when we contact and learn, connect with the local Aboriginal artists. We have a direct interaction, like similar to the concept is a fair trade tourism concept. So we connect with those local artists and then learn from there with them, and also learn how to do the Aboriginal painting, and the Aboriginal people also show their creative idea, and local tourists also learn of the authenticity, the related experience. So this is the creative class, the strategy can be really helpful to the how the tourism authenticity can mingle together. Of course, I'm not saying it's there is no negative impact. There is a negative impact, but I think there is a lot of good potential. Tourism can really help out for this, complementing this tourism authenticity together through this creative, the class strategy, helping out for both the locals as well as tourism experience together. I made it short.
Thank you. I see. Well, we have two questions. I think the first question by the second question by Rehab, I think it has already been answered, which is about the local culture without acting to be more authentic. Now, the second question is about does cultural glocalization influence the architectural scene in destinations? Yes, do you have any answer for this question, our speakers?
The architectural scene?
Scenery?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yes, Tamara.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it does does influence. Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to
in a positive or negative way.
I don't know. It's interesting. What came to my mind when I read this question is that, for example, all around the world, we have seen the renaissance of museum building, and that there are some museum building a spectacular architectural using very famous architects building spectacular museums, for example, and it seems to be a global trend, and the same architects have been invited to lots of different places, so we actually see the appearance of similar buildings, but often using a local team, a local like a very good example, I think, is the Louvre Abu Dhabi, where it's a modern building. It's a very, very unique building, but based on the reinterpretation of the traditional Medina style. And so it includes lots of Middle Eastern motifs, but it cannot be anywhere else, but it's still, you cannot really consider it an Arab building either. So it's I think it's a good example of glocalization, that using global technology, global approach to architecture, museum architecture, but using a local pattern. So I'm sure there are also bad examples, like copycat buildings, but also some very good examples.
Okay, thank you. Yes, another?
If I may, thank you finally for coming to the material culture and how it is changing. Now, so far, we have talked about immaterial culture, about service, about culture, about situation, and material culture is also very important. Coming closer to tourism, to what extent the restaurants, physical restaurant and hotels need to go with the local architecture, local environment. Those are also changing. You walk into a restaurant and you feel that you walk into Turkey, for example, because it's so Turkish. To what extent, what should be this reciprocity in the sense of environment? Thinking about Japan, I was a guest of Kazim, and he took me into a very nice hotel for accommodation, and he asked me to sleep on the floor. So that was authentic. And I'm not saying that in a negative sense, don't take me wrong. It was, I know the culture of sleeping on the floor. I'm Asian originally, so it's no problem. But then to what extent we revise the local culture or not revise the local culture and immaterial culture, and to what extent we should or shouldn't. And that's something I would like to ask to bring material and immaterial together now.
Thank you, Jafar. Any additional points for the question, Aslan, Ajze? No? Okay.
Well,
So
it's a bit hard because I assume that it's more architectural landscape of that whole city. It's not just only influenced by the local suppliers or tourism industry. It's also government policies as well. So it's like some of the heritage buildings cannot be modified or reconstructed because they're listed as heritage sites. So then, of course, we can't do anything. That helps for they become the traditional attractions. So it's not always the tourism the one is the influence to make the changes, the architecture scene. I think there are a lot of the economic development, government policies, and it could also, however, the tourism industry one who can actually enforce for the government's policy to protect the landscapes of the city. So I wouldn't say it's all tourism all played it's like negative role. We are the one who actually protect that whole the city environment as the main example of represent their traditional culture of that city like that. So that's why World Heritage Sites they play that kind of role. And I remember when I went to Morocco, it was amazing. The one side of city is the old city, the other one is the modern city. So when you walk into the old city, at the front gate there is an ATM machine, but after that there is no ATM machine. Only you can have little donkeys carry all this little heavy stuff, and people making those the cultural things for living by hands. Everything is by hands. So and of course the Jafar, you talk about sleeping on the floor. That is another way of also keeping that tradition in the whole city. It's showing that kind of the keeping that the landscape of the old city environment like that. But of course, when you get out of that city, you back to again normal modern style of the city landscape. So I wouldn't say it's tourism the one who just make that negative impact. There is also a positive side of that.
And I think very often tourism or tourists make local people more aware of their heritage, their values, their resources.
Yeah.
Like in Hungary, in the rural areas, the traditional buildings were often made of either brick, but even before a certain kind of mud, and with a thatched roof. They were, quite very rural and not very comfortable by 21st century standards. So and in the 80s and 90s, especially in the 90s, when after the socialist system collapsed, most people living in the countryside, they wanted to have a new house, a different one. A two-story house, a big house. So the villages were very quickly losing their traditional style, and tourism had nothing to do with it. And then when the tourists came, and they actually appreciated the few remaining traditional buildings when it came to rural tourism, rural accommodation. Then the locals started to realize that, wow, these old buildings actually might have a value. So we should not probably rebuild everything or destroy everything, but build a completely new village there. So the tourists actually made, again, in these villages as well, made a positive change. And their appreciation increased the value of heritage.
Definitely, Tamara. That is a great example, actually. That's so. It's of course the globalization, economic globalizations really influence the way of the building the city's landscape, because there are so many skyscraper buildings like Hong Kong, Seoul, New York. They're all same, right? There's not much of a differentiation across all the cities, and that's what they resemble of there anyway. But and they used it as for innovation and technology. That's why they try to influence all that, the change of that city landscape. But tourism can play, they actually protecting that landscape under World Heritage Site. And as you mentioned, it led into the appreciation of that, cultural attraction in the end. So that's the good point.
Okay, thank you. I think the webinar is becoming more interactive, so we may need some more time to be more interactive.
May I jump in?
Yes. Without you, it is not possible, Jafar. Yes.
Again, when we bring something from the past into the present for the enjoyment of the tourists, it has to be something that local people feel good about it. This is extremely important in my opinion. One example of material and immaterial culture that has brought forward and in my opinion has been appreciated is the example of Paradores of Spain. Mm-hmm. The old historical buildings that were, if neglected, they would have been leveled off and nobody would take care of them. They have turned them into 5-star hotels. I have not taken any surveys in Spain, but I think Spanish people would be proud of Paradores. They would not be shying away from it. But some of the things in the developing countries we do, the local people do not appreciate it because they say we have changed, we don't want to be what we were. So this is something I would like us to keep in mind, that at what we do at the end, the host community should appreciate and value it rather than make an artificial attitude for them that in front of the tourists they pretend it, but in the back of their mind are really against it.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I think there's also a question about the impact of authenticity. It's possible risks, potential risk. I think, Jafar, you already gave the answer for this question in your former, speech. I think the example that you gave about the Japanese culture and just lying on the bed, on the ground. So it can be, I think, yes.
May I?
Please, yes.
Act as a messenger. Our SCOT admin is telling me a number of people are watching us on YouTube live, and they have some questions. So if you let me read one of their questions,
we can get one question from YouTube now.
Yeah. How does the lockdown made impact on localization and globalization? In Budapest, for example? This is one question.
That's a good question, I think. Yeah.
Excellent question. What happened is that everybody started ordering food from restaurants, and that previously we had the Hungarian companies, Hungarian brands organizing this service, this food delivery service, and then apparently it seemed to be such a lucrative business that one of the largest international food delivery company came in and brought up one of these local companies. So so we have now a global player in this market. But I mean, the lockdown meant inactivity. So not much has changed, I think, besides this. It meant that everybody was staying at home, hotels closed, restaurants closed, nobody could leave their home after, 8 o'clock. So everything just stopped, basically.
Yes. Aslan, do we have any change in Turkey?
Yes, we do, because there are some other factors that I think we should add. Number one, lockdown was very important. And currently, number two, for the last 1 year, I have to say the economic crisis, the economic degradation in Turkey has been very much effective. And the increase of domestic tourism in Turkey and the declining demand for international travel, because the currency is really deteriorating currently. I mean, as I said, for the last 1 year. And that led, very interestingly, to the emergence of new types of tourism and new destinations. And this is very interesting. Metin Hocam, you probably have known that there are new rail routes now, scenic railways that, travel from one part of the country to another. And that's very interesting. That wasn't something that we had before. There is a growing interest in gastrotourism, for example, towards, again, to the eastern parts of the country, which is climatically not so much fitting into the mass tourism type of tourism. And those were some new developments. And I think, for environmental reasons, for, authenticity reasons, the pandemic has given us an opportunity to rethink how we are organizing tourism, architecture-wise as well, because that was something else that I was thinking about. If we're talking about restaurants, I think we still have some sort of variety in architecture, but in the hotel businesses in Turkey, we're kind of standard. And we adopt the Western architectural models and the Western standards. And that's kind of like, we're not very creative in the way that we serve tourists, in the way that we incorporate different activities in our tourism businesses. So that was one thing. I think the pandemic will give us an opportunity to develop, areas of domestic tourism in Turkey.
I think, may I add also here, when the lockdown is relaxed and people can move around, we should not forget that staycation became more popular. Being a tourist in your own city or in the nearby city became extremely popular and is practiced right now. I was talking yesterday to tourism operators of the developing countries, and they said their occupancy rate in hotels is much higher now than before coronavirus, and it's all domestic tourism. So domestic tourism is boiling when the lockdown is relaxed. It's a boiling business. It's a hot business, and it's making a big difference. Finally, people are finding their own. They are discovering themselves, their own environment, their own cities, their own country.
Yeah, I would like to add that point, because we've been discussing about similar issues like impact of COVID on destination, how we can overcome that, challenges, because clearly the COVID really negatively influenced tourism industry, but other industry doing really well. I heard like a music instruments consumption went up because people stay at home, and alcohol consumption went up too. So because I heard like wine sale was really booming because people stay at home and of course impacted by the COVID. But and that led to, of course, the rise of domestic tourism, regional tourism, local tourism. But another point is the technology helps out, like a virtual tour has become popular. So what happened there is like now is the community had to learn to use their mobile phone or any other just a simple device to the picture of that local area, and also hiring local tour guides to explain about the local culture and storytelling of that experience. And then they uploading as a part of virtual tour. So there is a lot of websites which is people don't need to travel, but another way of also give the opportunity for people to experiencing the local area using that technology like that. So of course the virtual tour has been there, and virtual reality, and it's become more popular, but it's been often used as a additional experience in the museums or visitor center. But now it's even tour guide. They also started to use it another way of surviving their business, because they don't have much of people coming to their tour. So so in the international people who cannot visit that local destination, the tour guide is the one who filming in the area and upload it on the virtual tour website. And so then the international people, you don't need to pay a lot, like $5 or $10. I'm not sure exact price, but it's a cheaper way of also to connect the people using this virtual tour. So it demonstrating localization, but also, again, relying on the globalized technology in that way.
Thank you. I think we also did a study last year, I think, about the food consumption of Turkish households because of this COVID. I think what we can see is there's a kind of, radical transformation of food consumption at homes in Turkey, as well as I think in other countries. People, need more space in the kitchen and more space in the fridge. So they mostly, prefer using and cooking frozen food. They first buy, fresh food and vegetables and so on. They prepare it, they, cook it and put it into the fridge, and then they cook it, as long as they need it later on. So this is not a typical way of Turkish, food consumption, but it is changing now, because it becomes much easier for the people, either living as a family or by themselves. Okay,
this
so
is something really, sorry, it's so interesting that there are some countries or cultures where it's so common, frequent to eat out. So it's completely normal to have your lunch, in a restaurant, and not in an expensive restaurant, but not to cook at home. And in other countries, it's completely normal that you usually cook at home. And then the changes of the pandemic on these different cultures must have been completely different. So if you constantly eat out, then yes, you have to learn how to cook at home and how to store ingredients at home and how to shop, etc. If you normally cook at home, then there hasn't been any large change.
I think the lifestyle of young generations also is changing now. When I was just going out from the university last night, it was about 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. I saw a girl, student, who was coming with a packet of different pizzas on her hand. I think they ordered a pizza from outside, and they were studying in the school, I think, for the exams. But it was not a typical, let's say, behavior that we can see 5 or 10 years ago in Turkey. But even the young generations have, I think, changed in some ways. Yes, we spent now 1.5 hours, so I think we can finalize the webinar by asking a final question. My final question can be about the role of tourism, I think. Or I can integrate these two questions into one. Where could be the position of tourism in between localization and globalization, and what could be the ideal form of tourism in the future in between these two, localization and globalization, or shortly globalization. And so who wants to start for this question?
Willing to jump in.
Yeah, please jump in.
I want to challenge our concept of globalization in tourism. When we use globalization, as I said at the very beginning of the hour, we are thinking about Western culture going to the non-Western culture. This has been the pattern of glocalization, Western to the Eastern, or North to the South. But just before COVID-19, ask ourselves, how many Chinese traveled outside of China? The number is mind-boggling. Over 100 million. I don't remember the exact number. So the globalization in tourism that we are talking about is because in the old days, Europeans, Americans, Canadians, etc., traveled to other parts of the world, and we were accommodating them. I'm talking about globalization in tourism, not globalization in general. So we were accommodating them. Are we going to accommodate now globalization in the Chinese sense, because they are dominant? They did dominate before COVID, and if COVID goes away, they will dominate again. What sort of globalization are we talking? Globalization in tourism will we be talking about after coronavirus? globalization through the eyes of Chinese or through the eyes of the Western? That's my question for you. Maybe we don't answer it here. We cannot answer it here. But I think the game is also changing.
You mean, Jafar, as long as we can see more Chinese travelers around the world, so the form of localization or the form of new form of tourism will also change in the future. Also, it may become more
globalization in
Chinese.
tourism, not globalization in general. Globalization in tourism. The industry usually responds to demand, and the demand is changing.
It will be more dominated by Chinese culture or lifestyle.
Sorry?
So the general, internalization or general, localization culture will be more dominated by Chinese lifestyle.
That's my question, not the answer.
So
Will
you don't
it
want
be
to,
influenced?
okay, you don't want to give the answer. Okay. Yes.
I don't have an answer to that question.
Well, we can see, I think, in the next 10 or 20 years. Yes, Aslan.
Well, Tamara was about to say something, so
Yes.
I'll
Tamara,
let her
please.
speak and then say
No, I
something.
just wanted to say that, well, it was already visible that well, in Europe, Chinese tourists are still not that important. So it's 2-3% of the overall demand, but it's increasing. Yes, I mean, their language needs were being catered for, the gastronomic needs. So those hotels that wanted to host Chinese groups, usually, because so far they were mostly arriving groups. Yes, they realized that they had to provide food that was familiar for Chinese visitors. I think it's in that sense, it's becoming more symmetrical, or was becoming more symmetrical, that in the Western countries, lots of tourism services were transforming their supply to accommodate Asian visitors as well. And of course, in the rest of the world, it's still the Western needs are being met, and these are not necessarily that difficult. I mean, not that different. Different in terms of language, different in terms of gastronomy, and also different in terms of like in guiding, the previous knowledge that you can expect from a visitor is different. So if I go to China, I probably know much less of Chinese history than I know of European history, and vice versa. So guides or museums or cultural attractions need to prepare for that. But also all the visitors around the world now require, for example, similar technological services, Wi-Fi everywhere, and really high-speed internet, so they can stream their experiences online. So some of the needs that are also connected to globalization are the same. Some are different, and I'm always optimistic. So I think it's going to go both ways, and tourism industries all around the world, the tourism industry all around the world is going to take into consideration the Asian needs as well.
I am also curious if you can see more people, travelers in the future who are looking for, or traveling for, experiencing different culture or unique culture in other locations.
Yes,
because of tourism.
I do. And actually, what Isa said, that technology has become really important. That now a virtual tourism is becoming popular. My experience is that yes, we have access to more virtual experiences, which on the one hand is an opportunity for small communities, small destinations as well to show themselves what they have. But also we learned that a virtual experience is never going to be, or at least not in the next 10, 20 years, it's never going to be like the real experience. So these virtual experiences actually make visitors more interested in once the pandemic is over, once it becomes possible again to go to places. And the pandemic has given a great opportunity to domestic destinations, lots of destinations that previously were not that known or not that popular, secondary destinations, and also the small communities, if they have the necessary technical skills, could benefit. And again, that could be a positive impact of globalization, but only if they have access to internet, if they have access to the technology that's needed to provide virtual experiences that could be transformed into real experiences later.
Okay, thank you. Aslan, yes.
Okay, I think the Chinese angle is very important and very interesting to follow. I think the intrusion of that Chinese demand into the tourism businesses is going to be, an opportunity to innovate and to renovate certain destinations, and it's going to be an opportunity for growth. But then again, I want to make a critical intervention with another concept on this issue. Before the pandemic, we were also talking about over-tourism. There were certain destinations where the locals, for example, Venice, again, an example, several destinations in Spain were also, where the locals were complaining about not living their everyday life because of the tourist attraction. So I think this is something else that we really have to reconsider, not only for the Chinese expansion, but what's going to happen after COVID? Are we going back to this trend of over-tourism? And what about the carrying capacity of the destination? And there, I would like to finish with a single, sentence of Ernest Schumacher: "Small is beautiful."
Okay, thank you, Aslan. Yes, Ayşe.
I think it's these questions always bring this double side of tourism impact on destination, because depending on how communities or governments or tourism industry regulated themselves for not to create any burden on the destination while they are maximizing positive outcomes. So clearly this how the tourism can give them more opportunities, positive role on the local communities while they are still pursuing that globalized or standardized services and like that. So I would say is again some depending on the places or cultural gaps between host and tourists, because clearly when they have the bigger cultural gap they have between the host destination and the tourist, their own original culture, that will create again much the burden or negative impact on that destination's communities, because they lose their own identity. There are a lot of issues because of that. But we do have quite a good example. If we use a simple festival. Festival is one of the great example. I think the local community participate and try to keep their local identity, local communities' lifestyle alive, while there are so many globalized or the largest scale of the event or hallmark like a Formula One event or Tour Down Under cycling event that doesn't bring much of localization, but it's showing the globalized impact. But nowadays, even the large scale of events, they try to also accommodate, combine with the showcase of the local area. So it doesn't need to be always the globalized the strategies. It doesn't need to always bring the negative side and standardize and make it only showing the upgraded version of tourism services. Actually, depending on the communities, depending on the event organizer or tourism industries, if they do have some more stronger capability, or let's just say is a monitoring role for the how they can make the bigger outcome synergies between those the globalization and localizations, the boost. I think there is still good potential. I think the tourism industry can do that kind of synergies, not always the negative side of we are opposite to the globalization. So I think more community and industry need to think about the synergy, how we can bring that two concepts together to make it the bigger impact for sustainability outcomes like that.
Thank you, Esther. Well, Aslan just said small is always beautiful. I think But small money, I think, cannot be beautiful, you know. So yes, everybody perhaps may need, you know, some extremely large money, you know. Yes, I think that's enough. Jafar, what do you think? Shall we continue or just stop here?
You are the boss, you decide, but I want to go to small is beautiful, and small is what the small communities offer. And going back to another comment that Aslan made, even in a small community, you can have over tourism, which is the carrying capacity. So if it's a small community and you're receiving 200 tourists per day, that is over tourism, way over tourism. So it depends. So small is beautiful, I agree with you. And those who have it are small communities in the more authentic way. Actually, in Spanish, there is also something like menos es más. Less is more. So there are better ways of doing things. And the issue for the, since this webinar series is about small communities, the question is, should the small communities change or not? Should they go globalized or not? Should they go universal or not? And my answer is, hold on to your character, hold on to your culture, hold on to your colors. And if you change, it has to be the change that local people appreciate. After all, tourism is supposed to benefit the host community. We are not in the business of simply entertaining the tourist. Yes, we do that, but at the end, the host community must benefit from tourism. And the host communities that do not benefit from tourism will have anti-tourism attitude later on, and tourism would lose. So globalization, yes, but the level of that should be decided by the local community. And therefore, there is no simple answer for local community. Each one of them have to come up with their own version of globalization.
Okay, thank you. I think this is also a good point for our webinar today. We have a small community of audience, not more than 50 people altogether, but I think we had a very, you know.
We have a number of people in YouTube as well.
Oh, sorry, well, I'm just counting the people online here on YouTube, but I can't see what happens on YouTube or social media.
Very good. I think it was one of the very handful discussions that I have here in SCOT today. And if you let me open my bag, usually Professor Jafari asks us what is the lessons or take home lessons. And conceptually, I thought that globalization or glocalization, it depends. And I was thinking of what is the border of local? If you think of, for example, Islamic world, they call each other brothers and sisters in many countries, and they're in different cultures. But within one single country, we have many different locals, and they have different authentic cultures. So it's really difficult to define what is the border of local and global or global. And what Jafar said, that we cannot formalize what is this border. So, and the existence of globalization, it implies the existence of locals, because all these locals together are creating this global and the global trends. So I personally learned that isolation is not a solution to keep authenticity, for example, or locality. If we look at the human history, we had hunter-gatherers, for example. Then once they learned how to domesticate plants and animals, they left their hunting traditions and traditional knowledge and so on. So they changed and they brought this. So as again, Professor Jafari mentioned, so it should be appreciated. Any change with with the locals. So these lessons that I learned from you today, and I'm going to take it with me, made me think about the role of tourism that I thought many of the speakers, they emphasize on the impact of tourism on destination. But how about the tourists who visit somewhere else and bring back souvenirs with themselves, and they bring impact into their local community or locality? They are not only tourists to bring these impacts or these changes into the destinations. When you travel somewhere else and come back with, especially in Japan, they have a culture of souvenir, they call it omiyage, and they want to share their experience with the rest of friends and family. So this is also a kind of upside down concept. Conceptually, we have to think about this as well. So again, it was really interesting, and I enjoyed a lot. Thank you so much. I don't know if Martin, you or any other speakers want to have a comment on that bit.
Thank you, Kazimir. Thank you for the contribution to our speakers as well as our audience for taking their time with us this afternoon in Turkey. Well, I also learned a lot personally, from this discussion, and I also got my notes, perhaps, just to improve them, to write something in the future. And attending or organizing this kind of webinars is always helpful for, for the organizers themselves as well as for the audience too. I would like to say thank you to our speakers once again, and enjoy Jafar, Tamara, and Aslan the rest of your day on Saturday. And good night to you, Aisha. I think it's late. Sunday morning there, early morning.
Yeah, it is. But it's all right. I'm night person, so I'm not early morning person, so it's good. I can't be like Jafar.
Enjoy your Sunday.
Yeah, will do. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Very much.
Thank you
Bye,
so
everyone.
much. Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Thank you.